The Suez Canal looked, from a distance, like a clean line cut through the desert, a strip of water dividing two armies and two memories of the same war. On the east bank, Israeli soldiers stood in a Sinai they had conquered in 1967, looking west across the canal toward Egypt. On the west bank, Egyptian soldiers looked back at a frontier that had never felt settled, even when the guns were quiet. The story of Chinese Farm and the Israeli countercrossing does not begin with tanks charging through the night in October 1973. It begins here, in the long, tense pause after the Six-Day War, when victory hardened into occupation, defeat hardened into determination, and the canal became less a border than a promise that the next war would come. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. In June 1967, Israeli armored columns had swept across Sinai with a speed that seemed to belong to a new age of desert war. Egyptian formations collapsed under the combined pressure of air attack, maneuver, confusion, and command breakdown. Within days, the Egyptian army had been driven back across the Suez Canal, and Israel held the entire peninsula from the Negev to the water's edge. To many Israelis, this was not merely a military victory, but a rescue from danger, because Sinai now gave the country strategic depth it had never possessed before. To Egyptians, the same ground represented humiliation on a national scale. The canal, once a symbol of Egyptian sovereignty and modern pride, had become the front line of defeat. It was impossible for Cairo to look at that water and accept that the story was over. The battlefield left behind by 1967 was strangely deceptive. Sinai was vast, open, and apparently made for tanks, with long stretches of desert where movement could be fast and visibility could be clear. Israeli officers could look at that space and see room for the kind of mobile defense they trusted. Hold lightly forward, then bring armored reserves racing in to smash any crossing before it grew dangerous. The desert seemed to favor confidence, speed, and aggressive initiative. But the canal itself was not empty desert. It was an obstacle, an industrial corridor, a political symbol, and a narrow stage on which both armies knew the opening act of the next war would be played. Israel had won the desert in 1967, but Egypt did not need to master all of Sinai at once. It only needed to solve the first problem: how to get back across the water. That problem consumed Egyptian military thinking for years. A canal crossing under fire is among the hardest operations an army can attempt, because failure can happen at every step. Boats must reach the far bank. Infantry must survive the first minutes. Engineers must open exits through obstacles. Artillery must suppress defenders. Air defenses must protect the crossing sites. And bridges must arrive before the attackers run out of time. Tanks cannot simply appear on the far bank by courage alone. They need ramps, ferries, bridging equipment, fuel, maintenance crews, and routes that do not dissolve into chaos. The Egyptian army had been beaten badly in 1967, but defeat can sharpen attention. The officers planning the next war understood that the canal would not be crossed by improvisation. It would be crossed by rehearsal, calculation, and thousands of unglamorous details made to work together. For Israel, the years after 1967 brought a different lesson, and a dangerous one. Israeli commanders had watched Arab armies break under pressure, and it was natural for them to believe that the pattern might repeat. The Israel Defense Forces were built around rapid mobilization, flexible command, strong armored units, and an air force expected to strike hard wherever the front became unstable. Those were real strengths, not illusions. Yet real strengths can become traps when they are treated as permanent laws of war. The Israel answer to a canal crossing depended on warning, speed, and the ability of tanks and aircraft to arrive before Egyptian troops could dig in. If that timetable failed, if surprise was achieved, or if Egyptian anti-tank and air defense weapons changed the terms of the fight, then the old answer might no longer fit the new battlefield. The canal front did not remain peaceful while the two armies studied each other. Between 1968 and 1970, the War of Attrition turned the waterway into a place of shellfire, raids, airstrikes, and constant nervous strain. It was not a campaign of sweeping armored breakthroughs. It was a grinding contest meant to prove that the post-1967 line could not become normal. Egyptian artillery battered Israeli positions along the East Bank, while Israeli aircraft and commandos struck back, sometimes deep inside Egypt. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that the quiet moments might only be pauses before the next barrage. This mattered because it taught both sides that the canal was not a frozen line on a map. It was a living front, and every bunker, road, radar station, artillery battery, and observation post belonged to a larger system of war. Out of that system came the Bar-Lev Line, the Israeli chain of strong points along the canal's eastern bank. In later memory, it has often been described either as a mighty fortress or as a foolish symbol of overconfidence, but neither image is quite enough. It was not a continuous wall sealing the canal from end to end. It was a series of fortified positions, observation posts, sand embankments, roads, and prepared defenses meant to delay an attacker and give Israeli reserves time to counterattack. Its strength depended on the clock. If Egyptian troops crossed in small numbers and hesitated, the line could help hold them in place until Israeli armor arrived. If they crossed in mass, suppressed the strong points, and blocked the reserves with anti-tank weapons, those same outposts could become lonely islands in a storm. The most visible part of the defense was the great sand rampart on the east bank. It rose above the canal like a man-made dune, intended to make the first Egyptian steps into Sinai slow, exposed, and costly. To an observer, it looked brutally simple: water first, then sand, then Israeli fire. But obstacles do not defend themselves. A wall of sand is only as strong as the fire and coordination behind it, and Egyptian engineers treated it not as a mystery, but as a problem to be solved. Their answer was practical and almost startling in its plainness: high-pressure water pumps that could cut lanes through the sand. That detail belongs at the center of this story, because it reminds us that armored warfare is never only about armored vehicles. Before tanks can break out, engineers must open a way, and sometimes the hinge of history is a hose, a pump, and a team trained not to panic. Egypt's political leadership also changed the shape of the coming war. Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose name had towered over Arab politics, died in 1970, and Anwar Sadat inherited a wounded country in a trapped strategic position. Sadat is sometimes remembered through the peace process that came later, but before that, he faced a hard military truth. Egypt could not easily conquer all of Sinai in one campaign, and it did not need to do so to change the political world. A limited war, if successful, might be enough to shatter the belief that Israel's 1967 borders were permanent and that diplomacy could remain stalled indefinitely. That idea gave the future crossing its purpose. The aim was not a reckless march across the desert to Tel Aviv. It was to seize ground east of the canal, survive the Israeli response, and force the world to confront the unfinished business of 1967. This is where the story begins to move from grievance to method. The Egyptian army rebuilt itself around a plan that accepted its own limits and attacked Israel's habits. Soviet-made tanks, guns, missiles, and air defense systems filled Egyptian arsenals, but the deeper change was in organization and doctrine. Infantry would cross first and carry weapons capable of killing tanks at close and medium range. Artillery would hammer known Israeli positions. Engineers would open the rampart and prepare the passage for heavier forces. Surface-to-air missiles on the West Bank would create a protective umbrella that made Israeli pilots more vulnerable than they had been in 1967. The plan did not pretend that Egyptian armor could simply outrun Israeli armor in the open desert. It sought to create a protected bridgehead where Israel's fastest and most familiar responses would become costly. That was the trap waiting inside the canal. Israeli armored crews were skilled, brave, and experienced. But even good crews can be used badly when commanders misunderstand the battlefield. A tank moving fast across open ground feels powerful until it meets infantry it cannot see, missiles fired from prepared positions, artillery landing on approach routes, and aircraft that cannot safely clear the danger ahead. The opening battle of the next war would not be the same as 1967 because Egypt had designed it not to be the same. The Egyptians were not trying to beat Israel at its favorite kind of war in the first hours. They were trying to force Israeli tanks to attack into a carefully prepared zone, stripped of the easy air support and rapid shock effect on which earlier victories had depended. In armored warfare, the machine matters, but the battlefield built around the machine matters more. By the early 1970s, both armies were living inside stories they believed about themselves and each other. Israel believed, with reason, in mobility
initiative, and the ability to recover from surprise through fast counterattack. Egypt believed with equal reason that the shame of 1967 could be answered only by disciplined preparation and a first blow that would change the psychological balance of the conflict. Neither side was simply foolish. Each had evidence for its assumptions, and each carried scars from the last war. That is what makes the road to the canal so dangerous and so human. Armies do not enter war as blank instruments. They enter carrying memory, pride, doctrine, fear, and habits built from old victories and old disasters. In October 1973, those habits would meet on a front where the margin for error was measured in minutes.
The canal also had a cruel way of compressing grand strategy into immediate physical tasks. A president might speak of political leverage, a general might draw arrows across Sinai, and an intelligence officer might debate warning signs. But the first men crossing the water would face mud, fire, noise, and confusion. The first Israeli tank crews racing forward would not be fighting an abstract argument about 1967. They would be trying to identify targets, survive missiles, find commanders, and understand why the battle did not feel like the one they had been trained to expect. That is why this campaign belongs in a series about armored warfare. It shows the transition from the image of the tank as the decisive charging weapon to the harder modern reality of combined systems. Armor remained essential, but it could be stopped, blinded, delayed, and shaped by infantry, engineers, missiles, air defenses, and logistics. When the guns finally opened on the 6th of October, 1973, the canal would no longer be a line of waiting. It would become a crossing site, a killing ground, a test of doctrine, and the doorway to one of the most dramatic reversals of the Arab-Israeli wars. The battles that followed, from the fall of the Bar-Lev strongpoints to the brutal fighting around Chinese Farm and the Israeli crossing at Deverswar, cannot be understood as sudden explosions disconnected from what came before. They were the result of 6 years in which Egypt studied how to break a pattern, and Israel trusted that the pattern still held. From 1967 to the canal, the two armies prepared for different versions of the next war. The tragedy of October was that both versions contained truth, and the men who paid for the difference would discover it in sand, smoke, water, and steel.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.